Okay, so I wanted to give you all an update. So we're here from with Penn America, as I mentioned, and I'm a senior manager in free expression education. And we're going to talk about some ways in which that we approach the idea of having robust engagement in college classrooms. Great. So just a quick background so you have a sense of the viewpoint from where we're coming. Who is Penn America? Penn America is a nonpartisan membership organization. We're made up of writers, artists, journalists, and their allies. We're a 100-year-old organization. We are a part of the Penn International Network. And our work is really informed by our mission, where we stand at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect open expression in the United States and worldwide. We champion the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our work is really rooted in our charter, which we signed in 1948. So I just highlighted a few moments that kind of to pull your attention to some things that I think are so resonant still today: the unhampered transmission of thought, the ways in which we stand against any form of suppression of freedom of expression, declaring for a free press. And the last one here, opposing evils of a free press, such as mendacious publication, deliberate falsehood, and distortion of facts for political and personal ends. And I just, I mentioned that because, again, it is so connected still to today. And these are kind of the things that, again, inform the work that we do. So in the free expression and education side, where I work specifically, some of the things we do are consultations and convenings. We hold panels, workshops. We have a team tracking and analyzing educational censorship, the gag orders, book bans, working on issues of academic freedom. We have some major reports we've put out in the last few years, as well as our campus free speech guide, which you can find online. In the youth space, we also do work with high school and college students through institutes and summits, working on issues of free expression and education. This is just so you have a sense, our campus free speech guides for faculty, staff, and administrators. And these are some of the big bullet points that you can explore inside the guide. It has case studies, it has our principles, it has some advice and how-tos on some of the most difficult issues facing campuses today. All right, so let's dive in. So how do we have a culture of open and respectful exchange in the classroom? So I want to preface this by saying that we're thinking about the rising generation on campus. And, this is generally, but we're seeing that as, all of us know who are here today to talk about civics education. So they're arriving with less civics education generally. Campuses are often more diverse than the high schools they come from. And that's in all, the multitude of diversity that we can be talking about. That they're often much, first time they've been around people who have different political leanings and diverse in all kinds of ways. We've seen the rise of hate at the same time in the public sphere. And there's also some different baseline expectations about what campus should be, what that experience should be. So there's some more desire for a sense of belonging, more individualized experience expected on the college campuses. So we're seeing these different forces push in different directions, and we have a few slides here that I'm just going to, very briefly say, and of course this is somewhat generalized, but just to give a sense of the scope, the forces that are coming in onto campuses. Several years ago, we were seeing kind of a push towards perhaps more regulation around free expression coming in from the left around issues of hate speech, interested in more inclusive language. On the other side, we were seeing some fighting back against PC language and moving, against that into a more open free expression. And this was sort of happening, in about 5 years ago or so. It continues to today. But at the same time, more recently, we're seeing from the right a push towards regulation around things like critical race theory, against DEI initiatives, with the educational gag orders, and on the other side, seeing a push towards more social justice issues, anti-racism. And of course, these are happening simultaneously and continue. And you're also seeing with the increasing global campuses, more international challenges around the world where different campuses placed in different locations, how that's impacting free expression. And again, I mentioned earlier, but a rise in hate generally. So that is also pushing and adding to this complexity of all these different forces on campuses. So when we're thinking a lot about the classroom in our time together today, from in our view, where we're sitting at Penn America, we're really thinking about free speech and inclusion as not being two things we need to try to, that are on opposing sides, but instead, how do we bring them together? How are we always thinking about how these things work together? And we'll be talking about a few things today that can sit in that in-between space, right? Active listening, collaborative learning, sense of community, having patience, and this idea of good friction with each other. So when I say sense of belonging, what am I referring to? What do I mean? So this sometimes can go to a place where we're thinking about a campus that might draw a line around offensive speech, elevating ideas of harm and safety as a rationale. Potentially it could, doesn't always, but it can sometimes talk about punishing more for protected expression through official university systems, calls for content warnings, those inclusive language, etc. And we're all thinking about whose voice are we talking about on campuses, right? So there's conservative voices that are sometimes saying that they're feeling, less welcome on campuses. Just last week, and I still need to parse through it quite a bit, I'm sure others as well, but that University of Wisconsin survey on free speech on campus, that there is a sensation, a feeling that they might be punished more by faculty for their views, although perhaps not experiencing it as much as more the fear of it. But that there's this rising feeling of being punished socially through their peers, particularly through social media. At the same time, students of color, LGBTQ plus students, other marginalized students continuing to feel marginalization on campus. So we're thinking about campuses being open to a broad range of ideas and perspectives, how they uphold the rights of all students to participate freely. How can administrators look hard at these physical barriers, right, to being on campus, historical traditions of inequalities, and how they need to take really concrete steps to alleviate those burdens. And I mentioned this idea of good friction, right, and how we talk to campuses about this being an ongoing process, that there is no sweet spot we reach where we've reached and we're done with this work, that this is ongoing work, it's hard work, but we're on, it's a path, we're on the right path towards taking these steps. And then faculty, right? So faculty have this duty to encourage and model debate and dialogue in their classrooms. They can look at problems from multiple angles, help students find these opinions, lead these classes as a learning collaboration. Perhaps they want to play devil's advocate. This one I really like to pull out, teach the difference between conscientiousness and self-censorship. That I think those two concepts are often conflated into the exact same thing, right? We're thinking about conscientiousness in how we speak to each other in a classroom, and that the syllabus can really provide a great place to outline a lot of what we're expecting, the environment we want to have, and the spirit of inquiry we want to have in the classroom. These are just some reflection questions I wanted to put at the top, and we're about to get a little deeper into each of the issues I've mentioned, but I just wanted to say, these are some things to think about as faculty. How familiar are you with academic freedom, with protected speech and unprotected speech? Do you think your students understand this? And I was really drawn in the survey last week that I mentioned with the University of Wisconsin on some statistics showing that when students understand First Amendment and free speech protection, or have an understanding of what it is, they have a more kind of nuanced view of speech on campus and a little more tolerance towards some of the speech on campuses. So this is something to be thinking about, just to be aware of. And do you have language in your syllabus or elsewhere on speech, on inclusion, and on conduct? So things to reflect on in your own syllabus or elsewhere in how you're setting up your classrooms. So in the time we have left, we're going to get deeper into these. And I want to see, these are sort of the six high points that I'll be talking about, the six main topics: creating community, participation and engagement, accessible language, an explicit syllabus, collaborative learning, and the strategies for tense moments, which probably is the highlight most people are really interested in. So first of all, creating community, right? So I didn't mention this at the top, but I'll say it now. In addition to my work at Penn America, or I should say prior to my work at Penn America, I've been a teacher in college classrooms for the past 15 plus, I think, years actually. And I come from the arts. I have 2 MFA degrees in different artistic practices. I taught at in different art departments and campuses. So I was often interested, I feel like it was sort of inherent in the work I was doing, in creating community from day one in the classroom. This can be something very explicit. And what I always felt is that as much as I wanted to dive into all the content, because there's always so much that you want to get through, and we never have enough time, right? But if I could lay the foundation in the first 2 classes and really get to know who was in the room, and think about how I could create a sense of community, that actually we would get much further along in the class. People would be more open to dialogue throughout, more conversations. They would be more just really honestly robust, just from the sake of getting to know one another. So I personally find that creating community right from the beginning is so just so valuable and so important. And obviously it depends on the class you're teaching, right? What kind of icebreakers work best? Is your class set up in a circle? Are you standing? Are you in a huge lecture hall? I mean, there's so many different ways, but simple icebreakers like say your name and, your favorite book if you're teaching in literature, or, even as simple as what I had for breakfast. They really don't have to be very complicated, I think, to just provide a sense of getting to know one another. And I always recommend starting at what I could say are called low stakes, right? So something, again, that simple, what I had for breakfast, what I did on my way here, what I did last night, what's my favorite way to relax. Anything that can kind of loosen up this space is really nice to start with. And then roles and responsibilities. So I'm really interested in being explicit about my role as guiding the conversation. I'm in charge of the time, right? Like, you have to make lots of decisions as a faculty on how far a conversation will or will not go. You're in charge of making sure you make it through the material by the end of the semester. But I also like to say things, as simple as, I will be on time for class. I cannot make it early to class, but I will always stay 10 minutes late, or whatever it is. But to be really explicit about those roles that are outside of the actual teaching of the material, and to do the same for the students, expectations and roles around timeliness, or having a certain amount of preparation, or whatever is appropriate. And then rules of engagement. So how are we going to engage in this class? So creating a community agreement, this can, happen during the classroom itself, or it can happen as an assignment that you assign for homework that you can then come back to. There's all kinds of ways you can do it. I tend to just like to open it up for conversation on day 1, and I usually let everyone contribute and write on the board what people are, what people are adding into the conversation. And I find people have great ideas, right? The students have wonderful ideas that everyone can contribute to these. So some of the, I think, most, should say popular or often or listen to understand, repeat back what you heard, pause before you answer. One thing I often like to say is, if you're raising your hand while someone else is speaking, then you're probably not listening. You're already framing your response. So I like to ask people to wait while people are speaking, and then pause and raise their hand if they want to say something next. And I'm sure you all have plenty of others that can get added to this list. And why take the time to do this, right? And I mentioned at the beginning, I think that one of the key things is that when we have this community built, participants take more care towards how they speak to one another. They're more invested in the learning outcomes. And I also like to think about the fact that when something goes wrong, then there is something worth repairing, right? So if you're going to have difficult dialogues against, across viewpoints, there will be tense moments, right? Getting comfortable with that thought, just sort of, I repeat it to myself kind of often. Friction is okay. There's an amount of good friction that we want that I want anyway in the classroom, but that if there is something that becomes really tense, if we have built a community, then it's worth repairing, right? People won't be as invested in fixing it or making that better if we haven't already built up that community. So participation and engagement. So I really like to spend some time on this also. And people, I know people have different viewpoints on is attendance participation? Does attendance matter? Does it not? Do you need to be here? How much? Every class is different. But I really think being very explicit on what is participation, what does it mean to engage, how does that connect to attendance, is really important. Particularly, I think, for first-year students for whom this often looks like speaking up in class, right? If I raise my hand, then I've participated, check it off for today, I'm done. And what I would say is that the more you get people to participate and get everyone to participate in multitude of ways, this is how we really start to build a lot of people at the table, right? We get to hear across many different viewpoints because everyone in the classroom is going to have a different take, and we get them all a part of it. That to me means expanding what participation means. So, for instance, participation can be it could be, for instance, in this case, putting up onto, I don't know if you use Canvas or Blackboard or some other platform, but it could be responding to another person's feedback on there. Or I often will have students, they'll have to put up one post a semester and respond to 2 other people's posts, right? So that could be a way in which they participate in class. Maybe we do small circle ups with 2 or 3 people. Maybe it's participating with a person right next to you. Maybe participation means talking to your friends at home about this during the class, about the class material, but with someone else at home or a friend, or etc. So you can kind of think about participation beyond what is happening in the classroom. So to maximize this participation, we can think about incentivizing listening, incentivizing personal goals. And I like to think of setting these, again, at the beginning of the semester. I always think it's interesting that a goal I might have thought of for a student is not actually their goal, right? So if I know what their goal is, then I can help them get there. And I can also think of success differently, right? Success might be a goal that they have. Maybe it's reading a few extra books this semester, that have to do with the class content. Maybe it is speaking out in class because they tend to be shy and they don't often want to speak out in class. So that can look different for everyone, but knowing these, you can incentivize them as part of their participation grade. Incentivizing collaboration, so that means offering possibilities for collaboration throughout class, and really encouraging that this is a shared enterprise that we're all in together. So again, I mentioned that you could assess this in different ways. So I think involving the student in this assessment is so helpful, and it doesn't have to be a huge assignment, right? None of these things should feel so unattainable that they require recreating, the whole syllabus or a whole way of doing the class, but there are small things that can be inserted to help engage more students and bring more people into participation. So a simple, couple times a semester, having a short thing a student can answer where they might address the following about what grade they think they've earned for participation, and back it up. And so it might be things that you as the professor haven't seen. You can see if they're there, you can see if they've participated in Canvas or Blackboard, but how do they articulate listening respectfully? How do they articulate something they've done on their own outside of class? Something perhaps they did towards that personal goal, etc. So there could be other ways that they are assessing themselves that you aren't aware of, and you can only find out by asking. Another thing could be a survey, right? So you could create a survey and have them answer it. So like they just do a simple yes, no. I posted once on a discussion board. I responded twice to, student comments, et cetera. And they just hit yes or no throughout the survey, and you can collect that data. For me, this is a little more work up front, but it also, on the other side, it's easier to collect the information. So it might be an easier way in. So I think of participation as a skill, and therefore it can be built, and we can help our students build it. And it also requires practice. So it's that consistency throughout the semester. The good news of that is that we can get better at it the more we do it. And it can also, by kind of acknowledging that it's a skill that requires practice, can help us find that grace when there's tense moments throughout the semester. Number 3, one of the ways we can really help participants have, join more in class, feel they belong there, is so that everyone has an understanding of the key terms throughout class. Now, again, these differ depending on the field you're coming from. But these were just some that are pulled together that we might think we know the meaning of, or we know what we mean when we say them. But our students might not know, right? They might not really understand what this means, or whatever the terms are from your discipline. So just really in the beginning, especially, or anytime throughout class, when you're hitting those points or you're talking about certain ideas, taking that moment to explain what it is, to say the definition, make it it could be a moment of shared enterprise. We're all gonna write some of these definitions out. Let's have a conversation about it. Or it might just be you simply say, this is what it means for our class. This is what it means for this field. But it really helps, again, bring more people in so they don't feel excluded by words that are being thrown around the classroom, and it feels like only the insiders know this and the rest of the class doesn't. And this idea of being just really explicit about what those learning objectives are, what is neutrality, what's your, the ideology throughout the class. So I often want to say up front that college is a time to engage with challenging ideas and material. We benefit from this. We benefit from the diverse learning community we're building together, but that you are responsible for supporting your arguments with credible evidence, right? So that we're not going to allow for just arguments that are personal attacks, and we'll get into a little bit more about that later in our time together, but that we really want to base things in evidence. I talk about this being an adult learning community, and just acknowledging that I think is helpful in the way that it is different from high school and from what most students are used to. And students should be, are responsible to come and communicate any concerns they have with me. Communicate to be understood, not to win, and listen to understand, not to rebut. So that also is another one. And repeating these, sometimes these need to be said at the outside of a class, talked out a little bit with the class, especially if you're about to embark on a more challenging, perhaps topic where you think you might have a lot of differing viewpoints. And so all of this is part of trying to get more participation, right? We're still thinking about how the more we want, a robust conversation in class, we need everybody to be a part of that. So another way is to really build it through an idea that we're in a collaboration together. It's an active learning environment, a collaborative learning environment. You can lay that groundwork simply with language. Sometimes it might be appropriate to really talk in a we term, right? That we're going to be having this conversation rather than you are at the students. Referring to each other as colleagues could be a useful tactic at times, kind of giving each other a sense, again, that we're in this together. You can utilize whatever learning management systems you have for dialogue among students, embedding into that place. I really loved when I had students talk about experiences, a certain practice they had gone through, a reading they had, and I didn't involve myself. I watched the conversation happening. We used Canvas just to make sure that everything, nothing was going sour, but I did not interject my voice. And to hear them talking to each other, giving each other feedback, supporting each other was really wonderful to see on that. And I found that a great way for them to dissect the material without needing my input actually at all. When I say receiving feedback, that can be the students are receiving feedback, but also as a professor receiving feedback. So when do you check in with your students? How is the pace going for class? How was that reading? What's not working? You know, giving a place where they can give feedback rather than at the end of the semester when actually it's too late to do anything for that semester, right? So having little places of feedback throughout. And again, can be 1 or 2 questions, can be simple that you do. And of course, different structures for dialogue in class. You know, everyone has a different ways in which they like to engage. For some, speaking in class is easy, but for others, it's not. So how we can value all the different ways people engage throughout the class. And being really explicit, what is good faith conversation, right? So good faith discourse is truthful, it's goal-oriented, audience-based, it's about listening and talking, being responsible for having good faith in your discourse. It is not about only your ideas being heard. It's also not just about mere politeness. It does not mean we have to agree. It's not about martyrdom, and it's definitely not telling people or others who they are and what they think. So you're staying with the material, with the subject at hand, with the ideas coming around the room, not attacking individuals, right? As you move through this. And I should put it on here, but I know it's throughout the slide at times, but again, that idea of good friction, you know, I think being explicit about that is okay, that sometimes it will be uncomfortable. But if we stay on the topic at hand and we are respectful to each other, that friction can be really good and energizing. But when good faith won't always be enough, right? And this kind of comes back to the idea that if you haven't really created a community, you know, there might not be anything to repair. When good faith is not reciprocated, right? It's not going to be enough to just come from one person or one side. Perhaps it has been asked of certain people in the classroom too much and too often. There can be a lot of history and legacy that's going to make good faith difficult in this situation. Sometimes that needs to be acknowledged and absolutely worked towards from everyone on campus, but to the best of your ability within the classroom itself. And of course, a lot of other things can get in the way. So we're going to get into a few tips here just around quiet classrooms, providing neutral feedback and responding to issues of the day. So these are some of the some certain more specific items that might get into the way of having robust conversation. And we'll provide a few little tactics as well. So the classroom is quiet. How do we elicit robust engagement? And so on the side here, I put down a few ideas. And absolutely others can chime in more that they may have. So how can you've asked a question, you're hoping for a nice robust discussion, but it has actually not happened. So one of the things I really like to do in that moment is actually go into some small groups or do some think, pair, shares, right? Where you might ask a specific question, ask people to think on it and share with the person next to them. I'm a big fan of getting people to move up and around. That's not for everyone. It depends again on where you come from, but simply moving in the space, maybe getting people up if you can, finding a new partner, going to another person, small groups, to kind of elicit a little more conversation, and then doing some report outs. And I find that often can really easily help move into a place of conversation, and suddenly everyone's involved. Rather than kind of dragging conversation out of people. It's also okay to simply ask, right? I notice everyone's really silent. No one has an answer. Maybe you didn't ask the right question. Maybe people are actually all confused. And so it can give you an opportunity to try again, try a different way in. Perhaps the silence is because, students might not feel comfortable talking about that subject. And it's always good to remind students that it's okay to not have all the answers. We're often in society, I think, expected to not, change our opinion. I think social media has really created this idea that, once we have a viewpoint, we can't change it. But, and in fact, as we all know, we're here for this very reason, to grow and change opinions. So that is absolutely okay in the classroom space. All right, this one, I know there's a lot of text on this slide. Sometimes when I do this in person, I pass out a little scenario. Don't feel you have to read this. I'm just going to say, I thought a little example of the assignment before we talking about neutral feedback might be useful. So in this example, and we're going to think about how you give neutral feedback that's consistent with academic freedom and academic standards. It's not about not providing feedback. It's not about even really helping, a student who has gone wrong in assignment, but it is about not focusing in on a particular viewpoint and making that the subject of the negative feedback. So in this example, the city council has asked, we're going back a few years here, but the city council asked, is thinking about a bill to require COVID-19 vaccinations. You're teaching a government course. You've assigned your students to imagine they're the legislative assistant for the city council member, and they have to do research on the proposal, write a memorandum, laying out the benefits and the drawbacks, identifying changes that might be necessary. You've asked your students to include references to 2 course readings and to independent research. And you're asking them to address the legality and feasibility of this proposal, not your personal opinions about the issue, right? So you're really asking them to again, not write an opinion paper, but really go into the research and support this with significant research and readings. And part of a student response has come in, and it's on the right here, saying that even if they pass a vaccination bill, the COVID will be here to stay because Americans refuse to follow rules. In my family, there's COVID deniers who watch Fox News all day and think the whole thing was made up. And then they say one way to improve the bill would be to make it child neglect to not vaccinate your school-age teens. This amendment probably would not pass, but it would be a great way to highlight hypocrisy about separating families. So you've received this, and you're thinking about now, how are you going to give some feedback, regardless of your views as the instructor here. So some of the ways you can really provide neutral feedback is to refer back to the assignment prompt, right? So sticking with the prompt and pointing out what hasn't been done, right? So this student has not referenced texts. This student, you have not in this class done your research to reference some specific text. You can help the student understand a way forward. To take this to the next level, you need to provide specific examples. Focus on your paragraph structure. You may say your passion shows through this paper. However, emphasizing your research. Let's work on this together. Stop by in my office hours. So you're referring to the neutral standards, not the ideology, and the ways in which to help the student actually answer the question, because the truth is the student hasn't actually done the assignment here. And it's fine to say that, you haven't done this assignment. Actually, this is what you needed to do the assignment. So I need you to go back and do this again. And that's a good way to get the student to actually go in and do the research, as opposed to focusing on the ideology or on the opinion throughout that paper. And this is actually, I want to also mention, when we think about this as practicing, right? So you're really helping the student understand what it means to answer this question, what it means to write this paper. And it's also modeling a way of having conversation. Even though this is in a paper structure, it's modeling a way to have this as a point of conversation to talk across viewpoints, so that it would be fine to bring this viewpoint forward, but to back it up in research, to back it up in your in the facts and what you've learned. And another one that comes up a lot when we think about having conversations in class, and one that I think is actually more often a cause of stress for faculty and students alike, honestly, is do we take time in the classroom to discuss matters of public concern? And certainly this has come up very often in, I mean, always, but certainly in the last few years, where it feels like there's always something huge in the news, students coming into class, having, maybe something has just happened that's affecting the national conversation, or perhaps something local or something on campus, right? So, flyers have been put up. Certainly we see this a lot, some outside group maybe came and put up flyers on campus that are, anti-Semitic or, talking about, kill Trump or this or that. So we're seeing a lot of these really divisive things come into the classroom that students are seeing across campus. How do you make choices about when to address them and when to not? The first thing I would certainly say is that there is no 100% right answer, right? You are not going to make everyone happy who's in the room. Some people will want to talk about it and some people won't. And I think acknowledging that and just being honest with that fact is going to help a lot with this idea of, the good friction or being uncomfortable and not trying to get everybody in the space to all agree in that moment, because certainly, speaking up about matters of public concern or talking across viewpoints is not about making everybody happy in the space, but it is about respecting everybody in the space for sure. So one of the things you can, obviously do is read the room. Are people coming in actively talking about this? Is everyone buzzing? Is this a big point? Are you not going to actually be able to get into your lesson, at least not in the first 10 or 15 minutes? In which case, you may need to decide to bring it up or utilize one of those other things we talked about earlier, small groups, maybe a writing prompt. Maybe this isn't the thing that everybody should be talking about. It's just too divisive. You don't feel you have the capacity or maybe enough information to talk about it. Maybe you ask students to spend 10 minutes writing on their own, either about the issue or about anything they want, just to give some time to sort of dissipate, to help kind of clear the space a little and maybe refocus into the task at hand. You can evaluate if the thing that has happened is connected to your course material, because then perhaps you can use it as a way to still connect, to still move forward with the material you need to get through, but also acknowledge it. Assess possible impact, right? So how do you think this is going to affect who's in the room? What the subject is? Do you feel like you have the capacity to do it? Do you know what you might say? If you really don't, it's okay to acknowledge it. It's okay to say, this thing happened. We're all concerned. I really don't know what to say. I don't have enough information. And maybe, again, you choose to take some tactic where people have some time to process, or, maybe it's just right to say, and we're here to do X, Y, Z, so we can really, let's put that aside for now and really focus in. And sometimes that's fantastic. That's just what a student might need. Determining next steps is actually part of it, right? Determining if you have the ability to talk about it, or determining what you might say after class. If you choose to open up the space in class to talk about it, be ready to offer follow-up resources, whether it's something as, counseling is available, or come see me in my office, I'll help hook you up, or whatever that is, but just having a sense of what those things are, being ready for them, so that you don't open up the room for this big conversation and then close it up and walk away, and students are kind of left with, oh my God, what next? And so actually one of our consultants came up with read the room, right? So, and called this the READ framework for thinking about discussing matters of public concern. Just as kind of a nice, easy way to think about this. Oh, sorry, next slide, there we go. So I think, as I mentioned at the top of this, tense moments will occur. And this is, I think, often where people get really stuck. They are afraid of the tense moments, so they don't go into the conversation. I think one of the most helpful things for me is to remember always tense moments will occur. So I can be as prepared as possible, or I can kind of operate in a little panic mode about it, which, as we all know, feels really horrible. So having as many tools at our disposal for the tense moments, for me, for sure, has been incredibly helpful. So what do you do? So first off is to stay in charge, right? You are, as we've talked about, as the teacher, the faculty member, the professor, you are in charge of the time, you are in charge of the material, you are in charge of that tense moment of staying kind of above the fray. Respond quickly, right? So what that means is going to look different in different moments. And I have a couple slides that's going to get a little more specific here about what that could look like. Be prepared to shift, right? So the previous slide was about making a choice to talk about a moment, but this is when something's happened in your classroom and you really have no choice. It has come to you. So be prepared to shift and to go into this. And I said we'll talk about some productive conversation and de-escalation tools that can be used in a classroom, and consider what to do in the aftermath. And so we're going to get into these also in a little bit deeper. But I want to mention these myths, because I think dispelling these myths about tense moments is really helpful also for perhaps not embracing them, but maybe if that's what works for you, but at least accepting that they're going to happen. So first of all, if a tense moment happens, and it will, because we're all here because we're interested in these conversations that are difficult across multiple viewpoints, this myth that if you wait, it might get better. We want to get rid of that myth. It is not true. It will usually get worse, and it will just become harder to deal with. Other one is if we talk about it, it will hurt the relationship, right? These are sort of connected. So if I wait, it might get better. If I talk about it, maybe I'm going to make it worse. With the right support, the right tools, the right opening, it is good to you have to acknowledge this and go into it. It's not my job or place to say something. Well, if you are, the faculty in that classroom, the professor, it most likely is your job to say something. If you don't feel you have the tools, the ability in that moment to say something, it is also okay to get that support, reach out to whomever, the dean, someone else on campus, as some support structure for us assistance in this. But in the moment, it will be your job to say something. The I am incompetent line, right, can get us stuck also in that space. So finding the tools, getting prepared. And we have a few slides that are going to show you some of the things that you can say in a moment and how I like to use those to make sure I'm prepared in any moment. Only sticking to the facts, that is the myth that if you are having a conversation, just sticking to the facts is going to kind of solve the problem or make it all better. So, a student has in class blurted out against another student, maybe question, you're talking about immigration, maybe it's a class of government, you're talking about immigration, the student has bursted out and sort of questioned another person's immigration status. And, people are upset, that student is upset, comes to you, and you kind of, are saying, well, they really are questioning immigration, and you're kind of trying to present the facts of that particular argument. That's not acknowledging the impact, right? So we want to acknowledge the impact of what has happened, that whatever you agree with, right? Doesn't really, in that case, it doesn't matter, but it is that the fact that you're acknowledging that those words had impact and they hurt this student, they caused offense to this student. And that brings me to this idea that empathy equals agreement. So you can have empathy, you can listen, you can have empathy, you can understand this tense moment has happened. Whether or not you agree doesn't matter, or it doesn't need to be acknowledged in that moment, right? That you can again acknowledge the impact without agreeing. And that's kind of really important, I think, in these moments. So something has happened in class, and this slide is calling out, the next slide is calling in. And so these are two tactics. And I think they can actually be incredibly useful when you really think about what they are and how you can go about them. So you're in class, a student has said something perhaps to another student, and for instance, maybe you're to go back to the immigration example, they've questioned the student's immigration status. This might be a moment where you're going to choose to call out, right? You have to come to that decision. But calling out is essentially when you need to quickly hit the pause. It just means that you need to stop and say, let's take a break now, or, you want to end that conversation or at least pause it. I like to use the word pause because I don't think you want to end the whole conversation. We want to pause it for a moment because actually that wasn't acceptable. That was attacking a person. That was going into an individual moment in the classroom. So you want to stop that. And so, I think sometimes we get this idea that calling out's, this huge public thing you've done in like when a protest has come to campus, you're calling someone out on stage, but it can be in the classroom that you're just saying, whoa, I think we need to pause here. We need to take a step back. And it can be really helpful for the person who's perhaps feeling impacted or people. And also though, can just be a way to let the person who said it kind of know, whoa, that wasn't okay, right? And so these are that's a tactic we might need to use. Calling in is when you don't feel it in the moment. It is so jarring that you need to stop it, but it's a good moment to understand, learn more. So you could bring someone privately aside. What did you mean here? What was that comment about? It was a way to kind of call in. I actually think that calling out and calling in can work together, right? So maybe you stop and pause in the moment, but then you say, hey, let's talk after class privately. It's a way to engage deeper, go a little further and understand a little bit more. So I mentioned I would give you a few things of what you might actually say when someone I work with a lot called these her handy dandies, which is always stuck in my head. But excuse me, I honestly keep these written on a piece of paper. Sometimes I have them on Post-it notes around my desk because I don't always remember them. They can be used in class. They can be used one-on-one or in small groups anytime, but there are different things you might say. And I really recommend trying them on, Some feel right, some don't, but I'd really like to hear your thinking on this. I'd like to see if we might reach a better understanding. Let me see if I got that right, repeat it back because or maybe it is an interesting perspective. You want to hear more. And it depends, right? Again, if you're kind of wanting to know more, but you might, need to stop it a little more abruptly, in which you could say, oh, let's take, whoa, everybody, I think we're missing the mark. That might be a little bit more of a way to stop it in that moment. So it depends on the situation. So I talked about a few techniques, when a tense moment has occurred. Obviously calling in or calling out are part of that. Those little handy dandies are part of it. But there can also be, a moment you've had to stop something. Hey, let's go into a short writing exercise. Let's go back to the topic. Similar to the idea of giving neutral feedback, how do you go back to the topic at hand? We're talking about immigration. Let's go into this. What I want to learn is, what I want to say is, maybe it's individual one-on-one. Maybe there's those, think, pair, shares I've talked a lot about, or small group discussions. And it depends on the nature, how tense things have gotten. If it's incredibly tense sometime and feels like that people need a moment, I might just have them individually do some reflection, some writing. But if it's something where people might be able to talk with a partner, then that could be a moment where people might collect data. What do we know about this topic? What do we need to find out? So there's a lot of different things you might do, but these are some examples. And I did put at the bottom the need for aftermath communication. So I just put a quick do and don'ts on the bottom, excuse me, that I often like to refer to. But there is often, after a tense moment has occurred, a need for some aftermath communication. This could be in an email. Maybe it is that you need to address it in the next class, depending on when that is. Some of the things that I would always recommend is that if you don't wait too long. So if your next class isn't for another week, I would recommend send that email sooner. Be specific, name the thing that happened. It's not the unfortunate incident that happened, yes, the other day was, sad and we're sorry. No, you want to be really specific, name it. The other day in class, X was said, acknowledge the impact that it may have had or that it did have. Be as accurate as you can be. Talk about what supports are out there and also be positive about how you're going to work through this. You have a plan for the next class. We can all come together on this. So just really making sure that you're thinking, being really specific. What is the thing? How are you going to work towards improving the dialogue or the discussion across the class? And also, again, along with don't waiting too long, don't be too general or vague. Don't defend free speech without kind of a nod to all of the challenges, right? Don't lead. I've seen this one leading off, after, especially across campuses where people say, we believe in free speech. So this unfortunate incident, falls under the parameters of free speech. And that's it. And that's the end of it, right? Free speech has challenges, as we're all acknowledging. And so that is not, what we want to do in the first moment of this communication. All right. So as we get to our last couple slides here, academic freedom. Does that mean students can say anything in the classroom? We're not here for a whole course on academic freedom, but just to say, because we're running close on time, of course not. Right. So given everything I've said about conversation, about trying to have vibrant, robust participation across viewpoints, we have academic standards in the classroom, right? Plagiarism, academic integrity. We're not here to support falsehoods, harassments, true threats, etc. So that we acknowledge these are in a syllabus. So these are not the same as robust conversations, right? It is worth, and I mentioned at the beginning, it's worth knowing and making sure students know, right, that there are moments where classroom interactions might be a serious conduct or civil rights issue. So a generalized, I prefer to limit immigration, is not the same as a target possibly harassing, questioning a peer's immigration status. And in those cases, these might need to be elevated, certainly to some conversation with the student, possibly to a dean or to someone else if these things are happening. So that's if it's targeted to a specific individual or group, if it's gratuitous, unrelated to class content, or if it's pervasive and unwelcome, right? So a one-time comment, then you call the student in, is different than an ongoing situation. So just to summarize, we've talked about being explicit, to really explain what a college community looks like, to really help students understand criticism isn't personal. We're laying the groundwork for a different approach, that we're trying to create a great learning community. It might look different, but we're in a shared enterprise together. Getting used to the good friction. This idea that before we can have dialogue across difference, faculty have to set the tone. We have to make space for it in all the different ways we participate and engage. And that I really believe students will appreciate this feedback, these respectful communication skills, when they know it's a valuable part of their preparation, not only for their time in school, but for work, for civic engagement, and for their life. It is not a limitation. It's actually an opening into all of the different ways in which they're going to engage throughout their lives. And that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing. And we just made it to the end, but I know we started just a few minutes late. So if there's any comments or questions, yes, I can share slides. I will find out how to, who to send them to so they can be shared with the group. I'm sorry this wasn't a little longer. We don't have time. I would love to hear some of your ideas on how you have robust conversations and engagement in your classes. But if anyone wants to throw anything in the chat or unmute, I'm happy to collect some ideas as well before we sign off.